heard from me already, so I don't need to introduce myself again. That's a really boring title, actually. I wanted to change it to something like what athletes really eat, because I think the answer is probably we're not really terribly sure. So I'm going to show you some of the research I've done about different ways we can possibly assess what athletes eat. Those of you that have sort of been through a standard nutrition education will know, you do a 7-day weighed food intake, or you do a 3-day weighed food intake, or you do a 24-hour recall, all those sorts of things. None of those things actually really give us the absolute truth, or only in a very sort of small percentage of things. So one of the things we wanted to do was to find different ways of trying to get at the important bits of what an athlete is eating. What I want to do, as well as reporting some of the research, though, is just sort of throw out a few questions and a few sort of discussion points, things to take away and actually sort of think about a little bit. So there we are. All right. So why is it so important that we know an athlete's dietary intake? It's something we almost, the athlete comes in, we introduce ourselves, we tell them what we're all about, and then we start to try and find out what they eat. Well, obviously it's important because we've got to establish some sort of baseline. Before we make any sort of intervention, where are we starting from? What do we want to change? Then we can actually go back and see whether we've been successful in changing that. I'm always surprised how often that actually doesn't happen. People just say, oh, here's the athlete, he's training for strength, this is what he needs to do, and they don't see what he's actually doing currently. So we've got to establish that baseline. We also need to be sure whether the nutrition is a factor in the athlete's short or long-term health. I think very often we're absolutely cued in on this is how we want the athlete to be now. These are all the things that give the performance benefits. And very often the actual short-term health is a minor thing, and the long-term health is way over the horizon. We actually don't give it nearly as much thought as we should do. And I think that's quite important because, when you go back and sort of look at the athletes maybe in 10 years' time, we may be finding there are things that we did that perhaps weren't, very, very helpful to them health-wise. We need to really assess whether the diet, the one that they're supposedly eating at the moment, is a factor in their performance, or even in their recovery. So maybe that's recovery from training, recovery from competition, or if they've got injured, is their diet going to be a factor in their recovery from that and their rehabilitation? Do they have any special nutritional needs? And I know Ruben's going to talk about sort of Ramadan and the sort of pressures that can put on an athlete in all sorts of ways. But there can be lots of other ones as well. So a lot of athletes are vegetarian. And, of course, the first thing you do if an athlete says, I'm vegetarian, is you've got to find out what sort of vegetarian they are, because they actually come in all shapes and sizes. So, are they what I call an occasional vegetarian? So they're nominally vegetarian, but they eat sort of chicken or fish sometimes. Are they an out-and-out, really, really strict vegan? And a lot of people will tell you that they're a vegan, but then you realise they're wearing leather shoes or wearing a woolen jumper. So it's like, okay, you're half a vegan, not quite there yet. So it's really important to find out what your athlete means by being a vegetarian. The other interesting thing, of course, and I think perhaps more so for an athlete than for other people, is there can be big differences between different days. So, a training day is not necessarily the same as a rest day, is not necessarily the same as a competition day. So somewhere along the line, you've got to decide what do you want to assess. Do you only want to assess their training diet? And very often that can be quite different from their competition diet. Or do you want to look and see what they do on their rest days? Or do you want a combination of all of them? So there's a lot of choices there for us. And, of course, the other question somewhere at the end of it all is how many good days, out of a week of 7 days, how many good days should we ask our athlete to achieve? Okay, and I think that's a really, really interesting question. In an ideal world, it would be lovely if they all did 7 days. In the real world, that probably doesn't happen. They might do 6 and perhaps have a cheat day or something like that. They might do 5 and then go home and see their mum on Sunday and have a big meal. So lots of things can happen. So, you need to sort of understand how important that all is. Are we only good at measuring it? When I started, went back into academia and I started teaching, and I was teaching a module called nutritional assessment that was actually provided for public health nutritionists, but also for sport and exercise nutritionists. And so one of the things they had to do was actually do a weighed intake. I think we went for 3 days. And I thought, they're all nutritionists, they're going to be really pretty accurate. And I have to say, I have really seen quite so much underreporting in my whole life. So it's not just the nutritionists, they should have known about this. They actually showed exactly the same trend that you would get from most groups of the population. But nonetheless, students will tell you that, a 7-day, they should do a 7-day weighed food intake. How many of you here have ever done a 7-day weighed food intake? I did one when I was a student, and I had to calculate it all out because we didn't have a computer program. So I was using a slide rule in those days. It just shows how old I am. But, it's very difficult. And I think the more difficult now because we go out and eat much, much more. So what are you asking this athlete to do? Take the scales to the restaurant with them? Take the food apart, weigh all the bits separately, write it down? It actually becomes really, really difficult. So, okay, maybe a 3-day diary is going to be okay. Maybe it doesn't need weighing if you can get good portion sizes. Maybe we can get the information we need using a food frequency questionnaire, which is much less about the quantities of food than the actual how many times a week did you eat that. Maybe you can even do a 24-hour recall, which can be quite interesting. Of course, it's like taking a snapshot. You get a picture of the athlete at that particular point. So what did you eat yesterday? And, that's all well and good, but it depends what yesterday was. What were they doing? Were they sitting in college lectures? Were they training all day? Were they travelling? Were they competing? Whatever. So 24-hour recall can be a little bit, limited in a sense. So almost whatever way you choose, you're going to run into errors. Okay? Poor recall of what's eaten. So if I say to any of you, what did you have for breakfast 3 days ago? And you're sort of like, don't know. And you have to actually think about it. And we're sort of in the business of delivering information to athletes, so we should be reasonably there on the ball. That just shows how difficult it is. No idea about serving sizes. Okay, I had a wonderful conversation with a group of undergraduate students. We were talking about protein content in food, and I said, okay, how much protein in an average chicken breast? Dead silence. Okay, so let's move it back a level. How big is an average chicken breast? There's still quite a lot of silence, which was a little bit worrying. And then estimates of what the chicken breast was actually range from about 50 grams up to about 250 grams. So immediately you can see this is going to be a problem when an athlete says, I ate an average chicken breast. What does it mean? It's going to mean one thing to me and one thing to him. So, serving sizes are really, really important. Increasing number of meals eaten away from home. We've talked about that a little bit. It's really difficult to know exactly what's gone into that meal and how much is on your plate. Okay? Taking scales into a restaurant tends not to go down terribly well, not least with the restaurant, but the people around you. And it makes, it makes life very difficult. So back in the 1960s, you perhaps ate your dinner at school or your lunch at work, and that was it. You didn't go out and eat that much. Now it's very, very different. People probably eat 50% of their food at least out away from the home. And of course the other error is the the person completing the food intake, in this case we're talking primarily athletes in sport, they very often have a misguided concept about what the investigator wants to hear. Okay, so they'll tell you lots of things that might be relevant to what they've eaten, but they also might not be, and particularly with the use of supplements. So underreporting is endemic. I don't know how many of you have heard of the Goldberg cutoff principle, but it's a way of actually finding out where the significant underreporting is coming. So we can work out somebody's BMR using an equation. You then multiply the BMR by a figure that you can choose, and that varies according to the group and the size and what you're looking at. 1.5 is used, or it might be 1.35. And then all the people who are reporting an intake below that level, you're fairly safe in saying they're significantly underreporting. Okay, so in the group of postgraduate students that I told you about earlier, we actually found that, about 60% of them were significantly underreporting. So people would turn in a daily energy intake of, 1,000 calories a day. And you'd have a conversation with them and you'd say, well, if is that a habitual intake for you? Oh, yes, they'd say. And then you'd say, so did you lose a lot of weight in the last 3 months? Oh, no, they'd say. Okay, so we sort of have an energy balance conundrum here. What's happening? Something must be going wrong. So 65% significantly underreported. Interestingly, we had them do their intakes by 2 methods. So they did a 3-day weighed food intake and a 24-hour recall, and we could not show any significant difference between the intakes that were reported. So the underreporting seemed to exist whatever method we used. Interestingly, a similar proportion actually overreported their physical activity. Okay? So everybody's underreporting the intake, overreporting their physical activity. So apparently, 2/3 of the group are in negative energy balance, but not losing weight. So, we've got a problem here. Okay, so what athletes want us to think they eat? They will always try and tell you they're eating the perfect lean and clean diet. That's their concept of what they think we want to hear. And very often it's not. Very often they will tell you they're following a low carbohydrate intake, which is always interesting. It's like, you're an endurance athlete and you're telling me you're following a low carbohydrate intake? That sort of doesn't really marry up at all. They will very often tell you, rightly or wrongly, that they're using supplements regularly, and that might mean they're using a multi-nutrient thing, which might be okay, but they might be also using all sorts of other supplements. And it still horrifies me when I go into, it's a Holland & Barrett in the UK or a GNC, to see all the things that are lined up on the shelves and to think anybody can walk in and buy these without knowing very much about them at all. According to the athletes, they're always very well hydrated. And it's interesting if you produce a P chart. Are you familiar with a P chart? So it's different colours, and the P should be sort of pale yellow, and if it's dark brown at the bottom, they're obviously dehydrated. But having told you they're well hydrated, if you say to them, so what colour's your P, they'll point to something in the bottom half of the P chart. So obviously they're not very well hydrated. They'll also say they eat plenty of fruit and vegetables. So I don't know what it is in America, but in the UK, average intake, you're lucky if you get to 3 portions a day, okay, instead of the 5. And according to them, they never, ever, ever touch fast food, sweets, sodas, anything like that, ever. So, you have to sort of suspend belief a little bit here. Okay, so what's the reality of sports nutrition in practice? Where do these athletes get their information from? What forms their idea about telling you what they think you want to hear? So many athletes rely on coaches or doctors for sports nutrition advice. I was talking to Jennifer earlier, telling her about when I was in Florida, very hot, very humid. Athletes training had huge sweat rates. One young 18-year-old guy, good tennis player, his father was a paediatrician, And the guy was struggling a little bit with fitness, and his dad said, "Oh, just got to drink gallons of water." And, you know, the guy did it. And I was on court trying to measure his sweat rate, and his rate of perceived exertion was steady, and then it suddenly jumped to 19. And I always remember saying to him, "I don't think you should go back on court." And he insisted on going back on court, and within 2 minutes he was down on the floor, total body cramps, classic hyponatremia. Okay, which I never thought I would see. I'd read about it in textbooks. So, you know, but people trust the stuff that comes from doctors. They trust the stuff that comes from coaches. It's not always good. But of course, you know, away from the more elite athletes and the more recreational things, teams, squads and clubs generally don't have access to their own nutritionist. Okay? If they do, it's something they have to pay for. So going to visit a sports nutritionist probably costs somewhere between £50 and £100, so $75 to $150, so it's quite expensive. So very often people don't. They'll try and find another way to the information. And so one of the problems we have is that, you know, if you've got groups of athletes, teams, clubs, what they actually want to do is try and identify the people who most need some sort of nutrition guidance. And so they need a way of assessing this. And of course, it's much too costly to do a full dietary analysis on every person that we have there. Okay, so what are the sort of issues that we have to identify suboptimal diets? And this really started when I was working at IMG Academies. They had a wonderful idea that they would do what they called a global assessment of the athlete. So the athlete would have a score that included their physical fitness, their mental conditioning, their sort of, I was going to say injury rehabilitation, but their sort of musculoskeletal fitness particularly, their visual acuity, a whole lot of things, and of course nutrition as well. And the problem was, how can you assess an athlete's nutrition? Because, you know, and people said, "Oh, just do BMI." It's like, no, hang on. BMI measures what's gone before. It doesn't measure what's happening now. Do their skin fold thicknesses. Ditto. Measures what's gone before. So we needed something to assess what the athletes are actually eating now. So eventually we decided to actually use the concept that most people have, and athletes are probably included, that foods are really divided into good and bad. From the nutritionist point of view, a good food would probably be what we would say is one that has a high nutrient density, so a good content of protein, vitamins, minerals, you know, good carbohydrates, and a relatively low energy density. Okay? The bad foods would be the other way round. So they would have a relatively low nutrient density, so not a huge amount of vitamins and minerals, that sort of thing, but very much a high energy density. So you're talking about things that are certainly high in fats, almost certainly have a significant sugar content as well. So you've got, you know, this balance between good and bad foods. So developing a screening process to find this out really needed to reflect what foods were normally available and what foods were regularly consumed. Okay. Now, when we started this, we had the great advantage, so we had these 300 or 400 students, sort of high school age and a bit older as well, but they were basically all on the one campus. So we had a pretty good idea what was going on in terms of what food was available at the 3 meals a day and what was popular, what they tended to eat. The other thing that we were very aware of is that most young athletes would much rather be training or playing than talking to the nutritionist, because that counts as really boring on the whole. So it had to be something that was quick as well as being accurate. Okay? Okay, so we came up with something that we called a diet quality assessment that was going to look at the ratio between the good and the bad foods. In other words, as I've just defined them, you know, the high nutrient density, low nutrient density, that sort of thing. And sort of still very much based on what the consumers would think of as good and bad foods. If I'm talking to a fellow nutritionist, of course, we agree there's no such thing as good or bad foods. It's all a matter of how much of it you eat. But as far as the consumer's concerned, that distinction is really important. The nice thing about looking at the ratio is we're not worrying about the absolute quantities. So we're sort of going round this huge problem about what an average portion size is, because it's just really, really difficult. You know, and if you ask 5 different people, show me an average portion of cornflakes, you'll get a bowl of cornflakes that can range from 25 grams up to 90 grams. And obviously that's going to make a huge difference. So what we're really looking at here is the frequency with which they consume these foods. So the method had to be capable of identifying changes in the ratio. Once we'd decided which athletes, once we'd identified who was eating a suboptimal diet, then they would be the ones we could target for more detailed dietary assessment. Okay, this is just a sample, just a little chunk out of that, that diet quality questionnaire. It actually was only 20 questions, and it came only on one side of A4, because we decided that most people, and I have to say as I get older, I include myself, I see pages and pages of print. I'm not going to read it all, haven't got time. You know, so we kept it to one side of A4, 20 questions, and as you can see, they were just asked for each food category to tick the appropriate box. How many times a week, on average, did they eat foods in the following category? Okay, so they could tick none, 1 to 3, 4 to 6, 7 to 8, 10 or more. Okay, and obviously you can play with what the categories are depending on who you're talking to, where you are, that sort of thing. And the 20 questions were an equal mix of the good and bad food categories. So these were all things that were generally consumed by the athletes. So we were pretty sure that we'd get good answers. So the score is actually based on the frequency of consumption of the different foods. I think it's worth noting that this is all about, you know, the frequency rather than the actual amount, but also you get a sort of suboptimal or an excellent score can still be got regardless of how many times. So while we're saying frequency is important, you know, some people would sort of tick the 6 to 8 or the 10 plus box quite often. Others will tick it less. You'll still get a good ratio. So what you work out when you work out the ratios is anything below 1 is going to be suboptimal or poor. Between 1 and 2 is average or good, and 2 or more is excellent. Once you've got that, then it's relatively simple to identify what needs to be changed. Okay, so simple changes using the good old rule of 1 at a time, and any of you who coach sport will also know you only change one thing at a time, otherwise it can all go horribly wrong, and it gives athletes a very, very clear goal as well. So we've come out with this. How do we validate it? Somebody's going to challenge it. So what we did, we actually had, I think we had 350 students at IMG do this diet quality questionnaire, but then we got a percentage. I think we had 10% chosen at random, where we actually did do a 3-day food diary that was validated by a dietitian or nutritionist, and then went through the full diet analysis. So we got the 2 sets of data there, and then we can look at the correlations between the dietary factors and the diet quality score, just to see if there's an obvious link. You know, is this diet quality score actually working for us? So we've actually done this with 2 lots. So we did the adolescent sub-elite athletes, mean age 16.8. They showed a diet quality score of 1.26. Of those, half the group had a diet of average quality or below. So it was relatively unusual to see a good diet and very unusual to see an excellent diet. Given these, of course, they're teenage athletes, they're living away from home, you know, they're sort of doing their own thing a little bit. We also had a group later of some middle-aged recreational runners, considerably older, average age 40. If we looked at them, over 1/3 of them were actually in the excellent category. So they're actually they're doing pretty well. Average diet score was 1.8, so it's quite high, but as you see, the standard deviation is quite high also, so obviously there's a big range there. So two groups that are obviously a little bit different. When we looked at the adolescent athletes, what we found was actually a very good correlation between their diet quality scores and their calcium intake as assessed by dietary assessment, so our value of 0.7. And when we went back into the literature, of course, we found that, calcium intake is quite well documented as an indicator of diet quality. And typically, of course, teenagers, and I'm sure some of you work with teenagers will know, they're not always the greatest consumers of dairy products. We'd love them to be drinking milk, eating yogurt, that sort of thing. So milk consumption and therefore calcium intake is a good marker for nutritional status. Protein, as an indicator of diet quality, was what we actually looked at with our adult recreational runners. So protein, the percentage of calories from protein turned out to be the best correlation that we showed in that group. They did not show a good correlation with calcium, okay? And I think this is a very good reflection of the fact that older recreational athletes have a very high opinion of protein, extremely high opinion of protein, and that reflects the current obsession with their perceived need for more dietary protein. And a lot of those people would tell you quite specifically that's what they need as their energy source, despite the fact they were running 10 miles or whatever it was. Protein's not really a factor there. And of course, many of them were already eating in excess of the guideline daily amount. Okay, so changing dietary intake. So the sort of key factors, obviously motivation, delivery of suitable advice. We've heard all about that from Jennifer, so now you know how to do it, how not to do it. But also continuing support. Compliance. How sure are we ever that athletes actually do what we ask them to do? Or do they do a bit of what we ask them and a bit of their own version? And I think if you have a group of 20 or 30 athletes, you're going to see all variations on that. And the other thing that I'm actually left wondering, and the more I go on in the profession, I'm left wondering, do athletes improve despite standard sports nutrition advice, or instead of, or alongside? Because lots of other things can happen as well. So their training program can change. They might get a new coach or a trainer. They might have a different sports drink or a supplement. Who knows? So there's a lot of variations can go on there. Okay, effects of improved nutrition. Obviously, for most athletes, improvement of body composition is going to improve aerobic capacity. Great if you're an endurance athlete. It's also give you a better body image, and that's a factor in quite a lot of sports. The overall effect of better hydration, better work capacity, better concentration, and it even impinges on sort of injury recovery and rehabilitation as well. Interestingly, I know Ruben's going to talk about psychological things as well, but the effect of good nutrition on mental status is actually quite important, and I'm constantly surprised by the number of athletes who will say it was really good that you got us on the right lines with hydration because it gave me so much self-confidence. So the ability to actually support mental toughness becomes really, really important, and good nutrition plays a part in that. Okay, making the changes work obviously is important. You have to think of the dose response curve here. Okay, if somebody starts training and they've not really done any training before, you will see a very rapid improvement in their exercise performance. If you've got an elite athlete and they've been training for some time, they're actually going to be on the flat bit of the curve at the top, so you're not going to make a very big difference at all, but a small difference may be enough to move them up from 4th place into 1st place. And the time difference in the Olympic 100 metres between 4th and 1st was something very, very small, 0.2 of a second or something like that, so a minute change. So it all depends where they are on that dose response curve. So I think the ability to make some sort of quick assessment is really, really important, but I think we have to learn to find different ways of doing it, because I think the old-fashioned weighed food intakes and that sort of thing are really not giving us the answers that we want. Once we've done that, then we can go in and try and make our changes. Brilliant, thank you.